Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today, we're digging into the little-known history of Sitka spruce and its pivotal role in the First and Second World Wars. Plus, what was the timber industry like in the early 20th century, and what happened when a lot of those workers became soldiers? You've heard of lumberjacks. What about lumberjills?
Today, women in overalls, women in war jobs are to be found throughout the length and breadth of America.
If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting, more relevant. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, timber! So, Knute, I know a few things about spruce and Sitka spruce, and one that it's a tone wood that's very much in demand for musical instruments. For instance, I play the violin, and the top table of all stringed instruments are made of spruce. I didn't realize, though, that it was in such demand during the World Wars. Sitka spruce specifically. Why is that?
Well, in the World War I period, you're talking about the first great surge in aircraft production. And these were planes that were built for warfare. And the Germans and French and British were building planes, and Sitka spruce was found to be a really excellent wood for those planes. It was light, it was strong, it was fairly close to steel in terms of its strength, and particularly it was resistant to buckling. So whether you're using it as a strut or part of the wing, it didn't buckle easily. And that was really important because of the aerodynamic stresses on these early wooden planes.
I read somewhere that Sitka spruce could withstand a bullet hole in that a bullet wouldn't fracture the fibers of the wood, it would just pass through.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, it was known to have a lot of virtues for a long time. As you mentioned, musical instruments. Spruce was used for many things, crates, packaging, construction. In the early exploration days of the Pacific Northwest, people on sailing ships, if they needed to replace a mast, they recognized Sitka spruce as an ideal wood, both for its characteristics and also because the trees were tall and straight. And it also made a good substitute for rum if you distilled it. So
you could drink Sitka spruce?
You could drink its sap if you distilled it properly. They called it spruce beer.
There we go.
Yeah.
Wow.
So if you were away from England for a long, long time and out of rum for your rum ration, you could brew spruce beer, which was done by Captain Vancouver's crews and others.
How did you find out about the remarkable qualities of spruce and what it was used for? What interested you in this particular topic?
Well, I was interested in looking at some aspects of the timber industry during the wars. And spruce sort of leapt to the fore as this very desirable, precious wood that only grew really from Oregon to Alaska, and was so particularly useful for these aircraft. The Wright brothers' first plane that flew was built of spruce, not Sitka spruce, but of Appalachian spruce. So people were aware that it had these properties that helped people get into the air. And of course, with the coming of World War I, the demand for spruce was great, and we were the main supplier.
How did the timber industry respond to the demand for Sitka spruce? Could it produce enough spruce to satisfy the war demands?
Well, you had a lot of large timber companies as well as small operators. But there, at the time of World War I, there was a lot of labor strife in the logging camps. So logging had become industrialized. There were large camps of lumberjacks and all the equipment. Railroads were being built into the deep woods in going after the biggest trees and that kind of thing. But there were competing labor unions. People were unsatisfied with working hours. People were working 12, 14 hours a day. They wanted an 8-hour day. The conditions in many of these camps was really squalid. Hygiene was poor.
And it was dangerous work.
Of course, it was dangerous work. And it didn't have the sort of safety measures later on. People didn't wear helmets, and a lot of the work was still being done by hand. They weren't chopping trees down with chainsaws. So when the U.S. entered World War I, it determined that it needed massive quantities of spruce in particular. And they also wanted to organize and make more efficient for the war effort the Northwest timber business in order to make that all work. And they basically nationalized the Northwest timber industry for the war. The government created what they called the Spruce Division. And this was a military operation, so it cooperated with civilian workers. But there were also 30,000, think of that, 30,000 Spruce Division soldiers, people who went into the U.S. Army, were drafted or whatever, and who were sent to the woods to make this operation work. A massive spruce sawmill was built at Fort Vancouver, the Columbia Barracks as it's called, to be able to mill and process this wood. And wood was sent to our allies as well as building planes for the war effort.
Where was this logging done mostly?
Well, a lot of it was done in Washington on the Olympic Peninsula, in the coast. Canada was also providing Sitka spruce for the war effort. So Washington and Oregon were the main places.
How unionized was the timber industry at that time, World War I era, and how did the unions react to this military takeover?
Yeah, well, some unions cooperated with it. Others resisted. For example, one of the unions organizing in the woods was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, otherwise known as the Wobblies.
Wobblies.
Yes, and this is a radical union, and of course the U.S. government didn't trust them. They didn't trust the U.S. government.
War production required immense quantities of timber, and the IWW really controlled the great timber areas of the Northwest, therefore attracting the government's attention, particularly when the IWW engaged in strikes.
And in many respects, they were seen as communists or, people working against the interest of the United States.
50,000 minds made up to strike and strike like men. For 50 years they packed a bed, but never will again.
And the government basically created a whole new union in order to impose working conditions. And they were trying to make it all more efficient, right? They were trying to get the stuff out and milled and shipped as fast as possible. But they recognized some of the problems that unions had been complaining about as very legitimate.
One of the things they would do, they would work 8 hours, and everybody would walk off the job. The boss would, some of them would say, "Hey, we worked 10 hours on this job."
And so they actually went in and instituted an 8-hour day. They went in and instituted certain hygiene practices and organizational practices in the camps to make working conditions better. They created a union of their own. So the government had the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen.
Wait a minute. That's 4 L's.
They called them the Loyal Legion of Loggers. We called them the lousy, long-legged loggers.
Alliteration was apparently a government mandate.
Wave the flag with one hand and rob you with the other.
So did the unions and the government kind of come to an amity?
Yeah, they came to a working agreement, for the war effort with the idea that this is a patriotic thing. And of course, the government was just really calling the shots there for a couple of years. And then union strife did not disappear, although this was a major cause of suppressing the IWW, which had been sort of in the sights of the government as subversive for some time. They were pretty much able to drive them out of the union business in the woods. And actually, just as a footnote here, so in 1919, when there was a shootout between the American Legion and the IWW in Centralia,
we've moved the Mossback stand to the Lewis County Historical Museum in the Centralia-Chehalis area. And we're here to talk about the Wobblies.
some of the tensions were around the IWW headquarters, which was IWW members who were in the timber business and in the mills. And that tension between the American Legionnaires erupted in gunfire.
The Wobblies say that a contingent of Legionnaires broke ranks and charged their headquarters. And in self-defense, they fired back.
A number of people were killed, one lynched. But this is kind of representative of the kinds of tensions and the levels of tensions that came out of that war period, where patriotism and union organizing and Bolshevism, so-called, clashed. So the war didn't solve all the union problems, but it reduced the IWW to more of a bit player than it had been.
Any idea of the amount of production of Sitka spruce during the World War I years?
Yes, millions of board feet of Sitka spruce were produced. Let me look at some figures here. So the Allies are trying to keep up with the Germans, and so we're shipping spruce to Britain and France and others so that they can build planes they need for the battlefield. 100 million board feet of lumber from the United States. By the end of the war, the Spruce Products Division had produced nearly 185 million board feet, so almost double what was originally requested. But here's the productivity of it. From 1917 to 1918, so 1 year of the war, lumber from the Northwest was used to build 16,952 U.S. Army training planes, 4,881 French planes, 258 British planes, and 59 Italian planes. I mean, you can see the level that's going into producing for the war effort in just 1 year.
So, other than soldiers, who was working at these mills and out in the forests?
Well, civilians, largely, and the characteristic of who was working in the forests changed somewhat. I mean, some civilians put on Army uniforms and assisted with the efforts that way. But there was still a shortage of people. And so the government began to use women in roles that they had not been used in before.
On the home front, women enlist for less glamorous, less hazardous, but equally important work in industry.
Particularly jobs in lumber camps that had been held by young people, teenagers or young adults that were in roles that were relatively safe.
Replacing men who are called to the colors, these girls are operating one of the nation's biggest lumber mills.
And for a long time in the timber business, there had been women working as cooks or working as maids, depending on what kind of camp you were in. But now they were taking jobs. I mean, the one that there's actually a picture on front of one of the government's magazines for the Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen showing a woman, and she's dressed in overalls and gloves and boots, and she's holding a wire, and it says the wartime whistle punk.
What's a whistle punk?
So, yeah, well, a whistle punk was a job in the timber camps who was a signaler between the donkey engine and hauling logs. And so when a tree would be cut down and made to a size where you could drag it up a hillside, a choker would put on chains and whatnot that would secure it. And the whistle punk would toot the whistle to indicate when to haul it up the hillside. So they're basically a signal person.
How many women are we talking about? Do you know what the ratio of women to men were in them?
Yeah, no idea. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think anybody was keeping track of it the way it was more kept track of during World War II. But in World War I, they definitely were out there. They definitely were performing these tasks during a very limited time of the war effort.
I've never heard the term whistle punk before. It sounds like a great name for a band.
I mean, I've always thought choker was a funny job. That was a dangerous job. You could lose your fingers being a choker.
So as World War I turned into World War II, how did things change? Was there still the demand for spruce? And were women needed?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the years between World War I and World War II, spruce began to be faded out as a material for planes. You know, it was being replaced by metal, by aluminum and other metals. The wood was still used in some aircraft, but it was essentially by the mid to late 1920s, it was essentially supplanted. The government wanted metal planes. But with the advent of World War II, the demand for wood for all kinds of war purposes increased. Even before we entered the war, it increased. And the government, it didn't nationalize the timber companies, but it did create a wood product core to make sure that the industrial output of the forests was ramped up.
That is why the women of America, like the men at their side, must flock to war jobs.
And just as we saw in World War II, we saw Rosie the Riveter, you began to see more and more, indeed thousands of women in the Northwest timber business.
Women replace the traditional lumberjacks in some jobs. These girls work long, hard hours to get out the wood for the Allies' fastest bombers.
Were they called lumberjills?
You know, people called them lady loggers. Lumberjills, it's interesting. Some people don't like that term. They think of it as kind of disparaging. I mean, obviously, it's lumberjack, lumberjill. You know, that's the rationale for it. But the newspapers called them lumberjills. You can search lumberjills and you'll find all kinds of stories and clippings from the World War II era. And I think there was a lot of fascination with it. You know, this was an era when women doing man's jobs became a national phenomenon.
As more men are called for military service, their places must be taken by women.
I mean, millions, tens of millions of women took jobs that were traditionally male only.
Isn't this a funny place for you?
Not if it helps win the war.
And, whether they were welders or whatever, in the timber business, they began doing a very wide range of important jobs.
How was that written about in the media?
Well, there's a great headline, and it's an article by Stuart Holbrook that captures, I think, the attitude of a lot of men in the timber business. Lumberjills invade Paul Bunyan's realm is the headline. And then the subhead is, they're doing a man-sized job too in the logging camps and sawmills. It's interesting that Stuart Holbrook wrote this story because this was the guy who embedded the idea of the macho lumberjack in the American psyche. I mean, he wrote a book that was sort of the definitive history of the timber industry in the United States. So he's going from New England to the Midwest to the West Coast. And he viewed it as this manly world of men's men. And the lumberjacks were sort of the cowboys of the forest. Stuart Holbrook was a wonderful writer, a wonderful teller of history. He was a columnist at the Oregonian. He wrote many history books about the Northwest and other American history. But, you know, he was pretty darn sexist. Yeah, here's a caption. Pauline Bunyan guides this locomotive around the mill yard and finds time to keep herself looking attractive. I think this was something that women had to put up with.
Once upon a time, there were beauty parades. All the girls needed was youth and culture. But this is war. Today's beauty contests are in the shipyards, on the assembly lines.
It wasn't easy to invade Paul Bunyan's realm.
Men workers vote on each girl's appearance, job record, and attendance. For now, Miss America is at work.
So there's a photograph with Holbrook's articles showing women standing using PVs to move logs around. It says, "Ladies in a jam. Pick-pull trio goes into action to keep timber moving to the mill slip. These girls are getting their first lessons as lumberjills and ultimately will replace all men, run an all-woman sawmill."
It has an ominous take to this, the replacement theory here.
Yes, exactly. They
will replace all men.
They will replace us. Here's the lead on this article. Old-time lumberjacks are sitting around the camp barrel stoves these nights and muttering, looking for the end of the world any day now. Or maybe it's already here. Girls have invaded the logging camps and sawmills. Not just one or two girls, but hundreds of them, big and small, old and young, and more are on the way. From the Canadian border to the California line, the West Coast lumber industry is infested with women.
What's to mutter about?
So,
I don't get it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting to me is that he's more concerned about women working in the timber camps than he is about winning the bloody war. This was written in 1943. World War II, America is in it. People are fighting. And what does he care about? Gosh, all these women in the lumber camps. And he was really invested in this idea that this was a man's world.
Well, I'm curious. I have never read him, but I'm curious if he wrote about lumberjacks with the same sort of hyperbole, masculine, of course, hyperbole that he wrote about women.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So he described lumberjacks in
glowing,
complete masculine, macho hyperbole.
He loved that macho He-Man frontier world, and to him, the logging industry personified it. He was actually a lumberjack himself. He had worked in the logging industry in Canada and then came south and became a writer, wrote very well about it, but it's infused with this purpose. And so there's a scholar who used to teach at Notre Dame named Robert Walls. And Robert Walls wanted to kind of correct history a little bit when it came to women in the timber business. And he said, the subject of women and the woods has often been conspicuously absent from popular accounts of lumbering, which have remained largely a collection of stories by, for, and about men. No better example of this bias exists than Stuart Holbrook's classic Holyoake Mackinaw, A Natural History of the American Lumberjack. In colorful prose and dramatic imagery, Holbrook includes women as prostitutes, waitresses, and toward the end of the book, wives, all destined to satisfy woodworkers' corporeal needs on the edges of the nation's sylvan wilderness. Ultimately, however, Holbrook concluded that women's presence in the emerging timber industry of the mid-20th century Northwest served only to domesticate the timber beast and to expedite the complete disintegration of the tough and hairy species. And that's in quotes, the tough and hairy species.
So there you go, Stuart. But I imagine women had always been involved in the logging industry in one way or another. Didn't this just sort of kickstart or expand access to jobs for women?
Well, I mean, the government mandated that women needed to take men's jobs. There was this huge labor shortage. I mean, if you think about what the timber supply in World War I had to be, World War II was exponentially greater, a much bigger conflict, a conflict that required massive industrial production at every level of the United States. And so mill work was a place that women worked in the timber business. I saw the figure of about 30,000 women were in Northwest timber mills during the war. So that's equal to the number of soldiers that were brought in just for the Spruce Division in World War I. That's a huge number to be in that business where they basically weren't before.
But there were a lot of family-run small logging operations where women had been involved for a long time.
Well, that's true. And that really took off after the war because the timber business changed into where smaller logging operations were getting contracts to clear either private land or government forest tracts. And so you had this phenomenon of sort of the timber business becoming like a family farm. You had where the husband and wife were both working in the business, and perhaps the wives began with, keeping the books and cooking and that kind of thing. But many of these women were neck deep in doing all the tasks. That, I think, is partly not so much an outcome of the war of women being in the business and staying in it, although that was true for some, but I think it's largely due to the sort of family nature that proliferated with these smaller logging operations. But some of the women involved in this did get into it in World War II. There is a bit of a legacy there of people who made that transition. And Walls wrote a paper profiling a bunch of these women. In fact, what I read was sort of the introduction to this paper on women in the woods that it was published in 2002. So one of the women he profiles was a woman, Auda Greer, and she had worked as a whistle punk in 1942 and was a bookkeeper. Says, despite initial negative reaction from the largely Finnish American crew of older loggers, Greer was eventually accepted in her role, especially after men became intrigued by her penchant for knitting when work slowed to halt between signals.
She would knit chokers.
Later, she earned a place in local tradition by becoming the first woman to ascend a spar tree in order to thread the mainline block, a feat reenacted for this posed photograph. And there's a picture of her with the rope around the waist where she's, climbing up the tree. I know from my dad's experience in logging camps that the people who did that work, that was among the most dangerous things you could possibly do in a logging camp, was go up to the top of a spar tree, whether to trim it or to thread the block.
The high climber ascends the tree by means of a steel belt and a set of climbing spurs. The top has to be lopped off and the branches cleared. Hundreds of feet above, he hacks away.
And, there's nothing more, quote, macho than that task. And this was among the tasks she performed. And I liken it to women who worked on farms. I mean, women have run family farms in every respect, and we don't really question that. And, they also had always played a role in logging camps, even if Stuart Holbrook chose to look past them to this great male vision he was extolling.
In what ways do you think the Pacific Northwest logging industry changed permanently thanks to the demand for Sitka spruce, as well as women workers because of the wars?
Yes, well, I think, women workers being more acceptable in the industry. And I think the most significant thing was the 8-hour day. The Northwest labor advocacy for the 8-hour day, and then it coming to fruition, also increased pay. Those were part of some significant changes as well as improved conditions. But, the Northwest timber industry is evolving all the time in terms of what's available to cut, who's cutting it, what time of year it's being cut. The technology is, very different from what it used to be. And I think it just continues to sort of evolve.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. The video series is now in its 9th season. A new episode airs on Cascade PBS every Thursday night through May. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knute Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.